virtual circle, this virtual family that we have going on, that we can learn from each other, we can grow together. And I think that that's part of the journey, is just taking in the knowledge that's being shared and then applying it to our lives, applying it to where we work, to our nations. I think application, that's the important piece right there. But I also want to take a moment because last night, it was the full moon. So Grandmother Moon reminds us how powerful she is, but how powerful we are, that we have that capacity, we have that ability to walk in good ways. And one of the teachings that Grandmother Moon reminds us is what is it that we need to let go of? What is not serving us anymore? And I think we have to constantly reflect that in order that we can grow and we can walk forward in abundance and a prosperity and in good ways. So just a reminder, what is it that you need to let go of that doesn't serve you anymore? And lots of times that's our own limiting beliefs. All right, so welcome. We're going to get on with today's webinar, and I'm really honored to introduce our guest speaker who's joining us. I think he traveled to Ontario, but he currently resides in BC. So we got Jason Rasevych, who is joining us. We're honored that you're here, that you've taken a break in your everyday life work just to be here and to bring the good knowledge that you have and you carry and what you do. So the presentation today will explore strategies for structuring community-owned businesses while ensuring that individual community members can pursue self-employment through entrepreneurship. Great topic. A little bit about our guest speaker, who he is a partner at Deloitte Canada and a national leader of Indigenous Services team. He also leads the Indigenous Wealth Management Service line, which supports First Nations and trustees to manage approximately $1 billion in invested funds and supports the growth, education, and development of First Nations and its members. So he's joining us from Ontario, which I believe that's where he originally is from. He'll tell us a little bit more about that. Jason also has over 20 years of marketing, finance, strategy, governance, economic development, and, can I get a breath in there, management experience with various First Nations across Canada. And this last piece of information, which is phenomenal, he's recognized as one of Canada's top economic developers and has secured more than $500 million for capital projects, legacy infrastructure, and business expansion with Indigenous groups. I feel like we're in good hands today. I feel like some good knowledge is going to be shared with us today. So Jason, we are honored that you are here, and all of you have joined us today. We're honored that you're here as well. So this is really an open conversation. So if you have questions along the way, put it in the chat box, and I'll make sure we'll get it to Jason and we'll answer those questions along the way. But also feel free at the end, we'll open it up also for any questions or maybe a story that you have to share. So this is an opportunity for also dialogue. So listening, storytelling, sharing, it's all welcome here. So thank you for joining us. And so I'm going to pass this off to Jason.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. And great job on kicking us off. I love the energy of bringing the good thoughts, and also I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional lands where I'm on today, which is Thunder Bay, Ontario, traditional homelands of Fort William First Nation and the Anishinaabe of the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. And also like to acknowledge traditional lands of my community, Gunuguming First Nation, formerly Reserve Number 77, which is a part of James Bay Treaty Number 9. and also the other Indigenous peoples that are across Ontario that call Ontario home. So looking forward to the discussion here today. I've got a few slides that I've prepared, more of a topic starter because of the conversation around structuring community economic development, looking at community-owned business, and also supporting local regional economies where the community structures its vehicle for maximizing economic opportunities, but also providing an understanding and clarity around how those opportunities will also be shared more broadly, whether it's employment or entrepreneurship, of having some principles, guiding principles in place for that discussion. So I'd like, to also, with that thought, whether the housekeeping that Michelle went through earlier around hopping in at any point in time on any slide for any questions, and if there's any questions that are brought up in the chat, to let me know about that. And I guess for further introduction, from Ganuguming First Nation, I really appreciate and respect the work that is done by CANDO and also economic development officers across Canada. When I started out in my community, Ganuguming, I worked as finance and band administration, but I grew a passion of being mentored by my father, who in his retirement worked as the community's economic development officer back in the 90s. The community was very progressive when it came to training programs that led to employment, and then later joint venture agreements that opened up the door to sustainable opportunities for community members where there was priority for contracting and priority for employment. That was very important for me as a youth to kind of learn the ropes from these mentors, and then who provided me with opportunities at a young age to also lead certain projects for not only my community, but later on in my career with the Matawa First Nation chiefs related to the Matawa Nine and their involvement with projects like the Ring of Fire, the big mining deposit in Northern Ontario, and then other projects, whether that be in forestry or broadband telecommunication, fiber optic builds, and also community infrastructure. So that's a little bit of my background. Now with Deloitte Canada, I'm working on a number of projects. One is there was the trust wealth management that's been mentioned. I'll go a little bit deeper when we get to that specific vehicle, but the exploration of nation building for communities, capacity development, and also decolonizing corporate Canada's mindset to support the and respond to call to action number 92 from the TRC, which asks corporate Canada to adopt the principles of UNDRIP and FPIC. And hopefully this will provide a better understanding and more opportunities for First Nations in Canada. So the tone setter for the discussion here today, I think, is important to see where we've been at as regards to developments for Indigenous rights around having no recognition of rights from the Constitution Act right up until 1970s, and being considered citizen minus to the decade of firsts in the 70s, the expansion of rights with the new Constitution, Section 35 in 1982, and the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples in the early 90s, and the decade of self-government, and then getting into the 2000s with the James Bay Mackenzie Project, the TRC being established, the Idle No More movement. I have Ring of Fire in here because of presentations I've done in that part. But the point of this is moving from land rights claims to now the economy. We're in a new paradigm. And we see reports out there from the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, for example, TD Bank and the Indigenomics Institute, that there's this $100 billion Indigenous economy. And what that is getting into is that there's going to be more opportunities for First Nations ownership in major resource projects, but also more companies that are looking to increase their Indigenous business spend each year in and year out. And I've got a few models for UNDRIP which talk about some of the companies that are doing well related to that blueprint. For the Indigenous economy, this is from the CCAB TD study. Back a few years ago, it was reported that Indigenous businesses are over 50,000 strong and growing at 9 times the Canadian average, that contribute 30 billion annually to Canada's GDP. However, there was a report by StatsCan last year that has that number now pegged at 58 billion as of 2022, I believe. This is expected to increase by 100 billion by 2024. I mentioned Indigenous business spend. Suncor has regarded its Indigenous business spend at 836 million a few years ago. I believe they posted over $1 billion number in their corporate disclosures. And there's companies across Canada, across industries that are looking to set up their Indigenous relations office and their procurement offices to identify and qualify more Indigenous businesses within their supply chain. Also, the federal government's commitment of 5%, which is leading also to provinces that are developing their own key performance indicators and territories, as well as some municipalities that are starting to open up their procurement systems to more Indigenous business. The rise of the ECDEV Corp. So when we think about the discussion here today of which vehicle to use, I'll dive deeper into some of the vehicles, and there's many that have been tried and tested before. There's been legal advice and also accounting advice from accountants on the best type of structures in the past, depending on purpose. There's been an upsurge in communities that are establishing these ECDEV Corps for a number of reasons, whether that be to implement an economic development strategy, take advantage of an IBA or a relationship agreement where there are set-asides, look at specific ownership and operation of infrastructure and natural resources or tourism projects, or and some of the purposes around separating business from politics, from communities that have had agreements in place, whether that be revenue share or other types of arrangements directly with the nation, where there could be some liabilities or some risks related to doing that. So we see now that there are over 500 ECDEV Corps in Canada, and this was about 2.5 years ago. So that number should have increased by now. And we'll see when the new stats come out, but I do believe we're heading up there closer to 1,000, and that some communities are developing more than one ECDEV Corp to take on certain functions or certain opportunities that are coming within their traditional territories. So I talked a bit about TRC called Action 92 and why this is important. We hear about economic reconciliation and some aspect of inclusion there, and where the TRC has specifically identified this action, there are companies that are taking a lead role in developing their reconciliation action plans. For example, I'm with Deloitte Canada. We released our reconciliation action plan in 2020, the first of its kind in corporate Canada. And we've noticed that there are many others that are releasing reconciliation action plan. I noticed TELUS has put one out. The Ontario Power Generation has put one out. There are other professional services firms like KPMG that also recently released one. And it's important for those corporate entities to understand the articles of UNDRIP and also the concept of prior informed consent of FPIC. I think that companies that certain ones are looking at it from an aspect of it's the right thing to do, but related to the process to develop actions around that, we always ask companies that are looking for support in this aspect of what's driving your intention to respond to this. You cannot do a reconciliation action plan in 90 days and expect this to be instrumental change of having a nice shiny document on the website or an announcement made. The reconciliation action plans are about decolonizing the corporate mindset, about integrating Indigenous cultural and values within the organization, and it's a long-term destination and journey that it's going to take time, but it will require board support, C-suite executive support, and the frontline staff of all to be moving in the same direction. And education and awareness are very much an important part of understanding bias and certain misconceptions that are there around how to move forward, as well as having the right structure to implement a reconciliation action plan. So I bring this up because it's important that we work with industry partners that also respect some of these calls to action. I remember a few years ago, I was working on a joint venture agreement, and we had asked to include UNDRIP and FPIC and treaty in the articles or the recitals of that specific JV. And a corporate industry lawyer came back, and we haven't seen these types of recitals in commercial agreements before. We're concerned around the risk. We don't understand the interpretations of them, or could be the risk, can we strike these out? And it was a limited partnership board that was advocating for it, and chief and councils that were involved as part of getting that information, and that was a mandatory requirement, and they agreed to move forward. And that's what also established the trust between industry and the Indigenous Act Dev Corp to say, if this company is standing behind free, prior, informed consent, we'll understand that they're not going to, that there's a low risk for them to just perform the minimum duty to consult and then to marginalize the community later on in the process of getting to the ink signing on a permit and then moving forward without community engagement or support. So it really is an important relationship document and principle when we think of partnership development. Talked a little bit about this, so I won't spend that much time on this slide, but from a reconciliation and education standpoint, non-Indigenous companies have been taking in the rewards and the benefits of natural resources that Indigenous people have occupied since time immemorial. So this is that new emerging paradigm that we're in, where there's a shift, where FPIC is, and treaty rights and acknowledgement and duty to consult in specific resource projects are being leveraged for more opportunities to discuss partnership and a reciprocal relationship that's around mutual respect and a sharing of wealth and power related to this new order of the economy. That more companies, governments, and consumers are considering social impact, and more investors are asking corporations and publicly traded companies what the status is of the relationship with the Indigenous peoples where they're operating on those traditional lands. There's been much discussion in the past where the shareholders of these companies and the investors are not getting the accurate information, and some Indigenous leaders would have to go directly to the shareholder to inform them of what is actually happening and what is not happening from a consultation and community engagement perspective out on the land. Then also the 7th generation principle of the Iroquois around meeting the needs of the present generation, but without compromising quality of life of the next 7 generations. So that mindset of looking at planning stages from the next 150 years, where we think we're going with net zero, with climate change, with also understanding what we can do to support community generational wealth and opportunities where trusts come into play. But for corporations that are planning on specific life cycles, we see that at times being a 3 or 5 year window of looking at return on investment. And many Indigenous communities will say, well, we have to look at a longer horizon than just a 3-5 year window, or for a mine life, whether that mine life is 15 to 25 years, thinking about the next 7 generations of the impact of that mine life and considering social impact. The few blueprints for UNDRIP where we've seen successful partnerships that could be talked about. For example, the facility with Fort McKay and Mikisew and Suncor, that's been announced in the media a few years ago around that partnership. The Lower Matagami hydroelectric project, where Moose Cree owns 25% with OPG in Ontario. Alberta Power Line Transmission, 40% owned by a number of First Nation and Métis communities. The Wetanikaniat project in Northern Ontario, 49% owned by 49 First Nations. That one was a $1.6 billion transmission line build to remote communities. A few others here. Wind farm project in Quebec, 600 million investment, 50-50 partnership with some of the First Nations in the Innu and Boralex. The Manitoba Kiosk Hydro project, the Kitimat LNG project, the Clearwater Seafoods 50-50 partnership with the Mi'kmaq Coalition, and the Cascade Power project in Alberta, again with 93 million to support their equity into that natural gas facility through that loan guarantee, and the Oneida energy storage that was funded by this Canada Infrastructure Bank with Six Nations. So when we see these types of projects come about, it's no longer limited to resource development within just a First Nations economy, and also the scale of these projects are in the multi-millions and in some cases in the hundreds of millions, getting close to billion-dollar projects, getting back to that $100 billion economy. This is starting to become the next norm, and we're seeing more needs for access to capital, more needs for board of director and governance training of these opportunities, and also best practices that are being shared more broadly with economic development professionals within EDO network. For first structure wanted to talk about is the LP model, or limited partnership, general partnership model. And this is very important for a number of reasons. Is when communities are pursuing for-profit enterprises or for-profit structure that safeguards their community's assets, what we're seeing is a trend of limited partnerships being established. And usually there could be more than one limited partner as well if it's multiple nations. I've worked with tribal councils where more than one community was impacted by a project or had an IBA with the project, where they decided to collaborate on a development and appoint certain board members to operate this. So we see this as a unique model that has been a trend, and it usually involves the nations being the limited partner, but they assign a director to the general partner structure, which you'll see here on the right, manages the company and represents the company in its business transactions, its business agreements, and its contracts. What this does is it reduces the liability to the limited partner, to the First Nations, so that it separates the business from politics, as well as you cannot have a majority board with elected leaders or chief and council. And then when there are dividends that are paid back to the limited partner from the limited partner structure or the corporation here, that the limited partners receive tax exempt dividends. So the nations would be able to benefit from tax exempt dividends, which doesn't happen in the traditional corporation model. So this is very important from an accounting and from a legal perspective. The challenges around this is, of course, appointment of board, getting the board to get back to the community for engagement on some of the input related to strategy, having the board also create policies that support confidentiality, but understanding where the community engagement piece fits with agreements, policies for subcontracting to other businesses or joint ventures, and so forth. So that type of guiding principles and business charter need to be established prior to developing the structure. But this one has worked very well for certain projects that I've been a part of. One example here of a LP model that I've been a part of. I've been a part of a few of them in the telco sector with broadband ownership and development and operations, in the forestry with managing a crown unit that converted to First Nations, and the First Nations entering into joint ventures. That was the Ogoki Development Corporation with Ireland, Yamatung and Martin Falls. And then this one was Greenstone Gold Mine, which was established out of an IBA for Airland, AZA, and Gunuguming First Nation that is now about 85% through construction, with the first ounce of gold to be poured at the top of 2024. But this organization, the LP, has a unique board that is involved in the implementation committee, is involved in potential operations with the set-asides related to contracts, and also providing employment and training opportunities for their community members. So Monodamin is the name of the company. In March of this year, they recently won Partnership of the Year at the Anishinaabe Development Fund Awards. So this is their board and their executive. And they've been doing some great work over the last few years as a potential model for advancing, not just on mining, but also other industries, for looking at the specific chapters of their agreement. They've got over 50 joint ventures and opportunities in land development with logistics. They're looking at a solar plant for the mine to reduce some of the GHGs that the current facility would move forward on. And the separation of the board from the elected leadership of the three communities has worked, where there is that communication back and forth and that capacity as a board and as a group to develop the limited partnership model to pursue all of these opportunities that are forthcoming with the Greenstone Gold Mine over the next 15 years. On switching over to cooperatives, so with this specific structure, it's very unique to the co-op members being the owners, whereas the LP is the First Nations as the limited partners or the shareholders. Here you'll see the members being the owners of the co-op structure, and those members could be member nations and could also be members, community members of those specific nations as well, in a co-op structure where those members would elect the board would have the management and the workers and the producers and consumers of goods. These are unique models that have been considered. I've seen them in remote communities as well as in the Northwest Territories, where they've taken advantage of some of the challenges with being remote and with being in certain areas where a fragmented supply chain is challenging, where there's benefits to grouping together, and where perhaps there's more thinking around individual community members being a part of the membership or ownership or equity structure related to how cooperatives work. One interesting example has been the Arctic co-op here, which is headquartered out of Winnipeg, but they have 32 independent owned retail co-ops representing 22,000 people. And this is an interesting model where they work together as a cooperative for group purchasing, distribution of groceries, fuel, clothing, some of the logistics for their hospitality sectors in each of the 32 retailed communities, and then also are able to share in the cost for marketing, for the administration, for the overhead, and for any costs that they can jointly minimize related to telecom or recycling, for example. A few years ago, they've been exceeding sales of 200 million, with over 9 million returned to the 32 member co-ops, which then determine how the benefits flow back to the 22,000 individuals part of that structure. So interesting model to look at here. When we looked at these types of models before, it really depends on engaging the community on understanding the different scenarios related how the model could work, because there is some advice from legal counsel. Well, you can establish a similar type of structure under a limited partnership, where a limited partnership, you could create your rules to be function like a co-op, where the co-ops are under specific legislation for the development of co-ops and so forth. So that takes some time to look at the specific scenarios and to also seek legal advice as to jurisdiction that it's being established in, and which province, or whether it's being established as a federal entity, and how it would be structured as far as governance, which is of course an important point. For trusts, this is a model that we're seeing more communities establish, not just for settlement purposes, where that's been the main focus before, where whether it's a specific claim, a land claim, or a grievance issue, we've seen before Indigenous Services Canada promote trust in the past. I recall working in my specific community, where back in the 90s, when my father was tasked with developing the negotiations for hydro erosion settlement and a timber claim infringement settlement, the government was more, I would say, strict and paternalistic around how you would set up your trusts back then. And we've seen some communities struggle with understanding those models, because back at those times, there was the need to have them legally ready before a settlement would be ready. And of course, with community election cycles, a lot of pressure on leadership to move the settlements to a certain milestone before the end of a term. So now what we're seeing with trusts is the concepts of community sovereign funds or community wealth funds. We're seeing a lot more advanced models where there's investment for future generations, but there's opportunities to invest in community needs today, invest in infrastructure today, invest in community economic development today, invest in education or health programming today that's not being provided by government or other transfer payment agreements with the Crown. And also look at some trusts that also have per capita distributions established for community members. So the trust function and vehicle has evolved over the last 2 decades, where we're seeing modern trusts that are managing hundreds of millions of dollars, investing that capital for future generations, but are also putting dollars back into the community for current and future needs to also grow the communities, whether that be economy or grow the community's participation in a project, or get involved in certain types of project, whether that be cultural, land-based programming and infrastructure development, even whether that be supporting treaty land entitlement or land purchases. A lot of unique arrangements coming out of community trusts. This covers some of the more functions of what's involved in managing a trust. So depending on certain models, community trustees would be involved in decision-making of the investment policy. So finding investment managers that will pick the best portfolio for the trust's goals over time, preparing their strategies, their budgets, preparing for meetings, and also not just the trust meetings, but meetings with administration, as the trustees would be operating separate from First Nation chief and council, facilitating community engagement with members, providing and also being in compliance with the trust deed related to how the trustees need to comply with information that goes back to the community, and then also governance and appointment of trustees in that process to appoint or elect new trustees for future parts of administering a trust. So there's a lot of functions that go into the specific vehicle, but it's an important one to mention for economic development, because we're also seeing trusts utilized more for those communities that have impact benefit agreements, where there's an investment from a mining company, an oil and gas company, or so forth, that go back to the communities, either at DevCorp or their First Nation, where they're looking for opportunities to invest $5 to $10 million per year, per example, if they're fortunate to have those types of benefits, to say, what can we do to get a return on this investment? And some of those dev corps are forming trusts so that they could invest in that capital, along as look at investing in new business opportunities at the same time. And the last structure I just wanted to cover was the nonprofit corps. So this being important, I think, because it really is a part of where that evolution started back in the time where limited partnerships were not being as I guess as frequently being established as they are today, or for-profit entities, for example, where nonprofit corporation, there's still a major use for them for communities that are readiness around what a for-profit corporation would look like. And there may be certain functions for a for-profit corporation that may be geared to something more nonprofit. Like, for example, a project that has a social mandate, or a temporary or short-term project, or a make work project related to employment and training. We see many communities, if it's not ran through the Rec Dev Corp, that they would establish the nonprofit corporation to secure some training funds, to do some local community type project, whether that be community beautification or development of community housing projects that the community could take on without understanding what's needed in a business case to turn that for profit. Also, with training comes the opportunity to secure provincial or federal funding, and to look at that from an assets holder agreement perspective. The assets holder are the program that is run through ESDC, the federal organization, where community tribal councils or Indigenous employment and training organizations that are nonprofit could establish the credentials to be an assets holder, and then will be it'd be more of a streamlined process, or the entity would have more of a profile that they have the capacity to operate these types of training programs. Also, Indigenous health corporations are being established that are nonprofit, that are pursuing funding to run, whether that be mental health or other types of training programs in the community to prepare the workforce, or to have more, perhaps, control and say over how services are being provided in a more culturally appropriate way. And then the charity aspect of nonprofit corporations or foundations, where we're seeing nonprofits established, whether it's by a community or a group of communities coming out of a tribal council, that will set up a nonprofit charity or their fundraising arm to solicit funds for specific causes around education, around Indigenous rights, around cultural ceremonies, that is not being sourced or funded by their existing community structures. And some of it has involved gaming activities in the past, as well as far as charitable opportunities. So didn't want to miss the slide on nonprofits and these types of corporations, because at times they're also potentially a pilot model for the community to consider how it operates as a board, and to get some capacity to have some community members operate on a board before going for a profit. And some of these opportunities that are nonprofit then evolve into a for-profit setting. For example, construction. There's opportunity for the community to do a nonprofit corporation on the construction, build some capacity. Then there may be an opportunity to spin that into a for-profit or a limited partnership enterprise, and then grow that out regionally, out into the further municipalities or regions. Last slide here, talking about engaging the Indigenous economy. So when we think about community strategies around the specific vehicles, there's always the question, well, how do individual members participate from a business perspective? And there are some guidelines here in this slide, but that conversation needs to happen at the community level. And most of it needs to be supported with some planning or some type of study work on understanding what the community's values are around these opportunities, and developing a business charter that is aligned with that generational thinking, or that 7th generational thinking, when we're thinking of community comprehensive planning, land use planning, ECDEV planning. A lot of those planning processes could be leveraged to develop that community charter if they're already done. If they're not, then there could be some resources to engage on some of those priorities. If it is a priority with the community, an economic leakage study is a great way of looking at where the community spend going from the community's households to the First Nation administration, and where can that economic leakage be plugged up by an ECDEV Corp that could take on those functions of revenue and take on those opportunities, or individuals in the community. So sharing these types of information with the community, identifying from an inventory who's got business capacity out there, who would like to pursue the opportunity as a contractor or an entrepreneur. We see a lot more of the youth going away for skills trades training that could definitely leverage those red seal certifications to become contractors through a subcontract with their ECDEV Corp, with the local community, rather than a non-Indigenous business that perhaps may not provide that level of mentoring that individual youth or contractors would require. And then more opportunities for access to capital through Aboriginal financial institutions or through trust funds with the community. We're seeing more support there from First Nation administration leadership to support more community members that would like to take on these contracting opportunities. But then again, there needs to be that discussion of understanding clear guidelines and policy for how the First Nations corporation participates in certain industries, and how individuals can participate without it being competitive, where the First Nation is taking opportunities away from some of those entrepreneurs. So that's pretty much it for the presentation. I'm just ending on this slide with policy here. This is what we try to share with corporate Canada on thinking of all the different policies around this space. And for communities that develop an ECDEV Corp, they also have to think of how they're going to engage their own community from a rights-based holder perspective, because they are then a part of industry. If you're separating yourself out with the First Nation corporation that's, for example, in forestry or mining, you then have to follow some of the guidelines of community protocol as a potential third party, even if you're community owned. So having all of those inclusion policies set forward are really important around these specific pillars. So I'll leave it at that and open the floor for any comment or questions.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jason. That was a very thoughtful, very thorough presentation. Lots of information that was shared. So thank you. We are going to open the floor. If you have any questions or comments, we welcome you to come on in or put it in the chat box. We would love to hear from you. So the floor is open. And Jason, are you going to share your PowerPoint presentation?
Sure. Yeah, I could email it out, and you can share it with the audience here of who you had registered and any other in the Can Do network, who would benefit from having that. And if there's any other questions that may come up after the call, I just wanted to add that I could also respond to them offline as well.
Awesome. What a great resource. Because there was a lot of information I found that was in this presentation. I'm a percolator, so I'm taking it all in. I myself come from the nonprofit sector, so the knowledge that you brought around that was really good, very honestly inspiring as well. So any questions? I mean, you captivated us, Jason. We're speechless. Great presentation that you brought today. All right. Well, since there's no, I believe you did drop your contact information.
Lisa has her hand up. And
Oh, and we got Ken. Come on in, Lisa.
Hi, I just wanted to introduce myself because I was late to the presentation. I apologize for that. I'm Lisa Kennedy. I'm with the Kiskanook First Nation. I'm one of the Ktunaxa Nations in British Columbia here. This was such a good presentation, and it was such good information. So thank you for that. And it's super relevant to us. We're in the process of creating a DevLP right now. We're hopefully getting the paperwork finalized within the next few weeks. You super simplified it for me in one sentence that makes it easier for me to explain to people what we're doing, is when you said the LP separates business and politics. Like that just kind of says it all. So thank you for that. So yeah, and I'm just glad that you're going to share the presentation, because I think I probably missed some important stuff at the beginning too.
yeah, that's I really appreciate those comments, because it's being in this field, I'm trying to provide information at a high level, but for those that are in these types of conversations at the community level or in your daily life, I want to provide as much lived experience as possible related to some ideas on communication or problem solving. And even with the, you mentioned separating business from politics, that's a difficult conversation as far as readiness around certain communities that may not have had experience setting up their own vehicle, and also from elected leaders that like having a say in control on some of the business decisions. And I've seen structures where there are still elected leaders still sitting on some of the for-profit structured boards, and in some cases some LP models. It's not suggested that this is a best practice. Just because of that separation of business to politics makes it difficult when somebody's wearing a leadership hat and then being on the ECDEV board. But not only that, for LP models, if you've got 2/3 of your board that are elected officials, that then corporation loses its liability status, and then the ban or the limited partners could be held liable for some of the decisions of the corporation. So that was another important point that was brought up by legal advisors, because at times working with 3 communities, you might get an appointment or a band council resolution. You've got 2 board members that are not on council, or 3, and then all of a sudden somebody gets elected to council and then they're being asked to step down and so forth. So we try to maintain that, that this has to be a full board of non-elected officials, but then it's up to the community. It's up to, how the community wants to direct that. And we still see many instances where there are still elected officials and sometimes chiefs on these boards.
Good words, good words. And thanks, Lisa, for coming on in. We appreciate you. All right, Ken, come in.
Yeah, it was my comment is regarding the call to action 92, and I was just playing throughout your presentation. I wasn't daydreaming, but I was toying with the idea of how to implement that rather than the slow walk that's currently happening or has been happening for years. So in 92, my thought, and I just throw this out, is to challenge the Indigenous youth organizations to put together a best practices of the corporations or other suggested best practices of actually getting Indigenous involvement in business. And I just throw one out on the floor. I don't want to take up everybody's time, but I throw one out on the floor. And there's absolutely no impediment for corporate Canada, government and corporate Canada, not to put the Indigenous communities, Indigenous bidders or potential bidders in the same position as the incumbent of an existing contract. So in other words, the incumbent of an existing contract and an Indigenous organization looking to put in a bid, the incumbent knows in a government contract 5 years ahead of time when that's going to happen. So giving 40 days notice for an upcoming contract isn't a level playing field for the Indigenous. So you need to give longer, and this is for other bidders as well, but I mean for the Indigenous particularly, you need to give them a lot longer than 40 days notice that there's an upcoming contract, so you can put together a partnership or play this out, do a business plan, whatever. So I mean, there's lots of other examples. The other thing is, on that same vein, a level playing field. And this is not going, this is not going into set-asides, but put in a target price. I'm involved in procurement, and I have Indigenous wannabe bidders saying, well, what price should I put in? Well, you have to put your own calculation, but we can assist to level the playing field, because the incumbent knows what that price has been for the last 5 years of the contract's 5 years, and he probably knows what the cost was of the previous contract, so he knows 10 years what the price was for the last 10 years. If you put a target price, at least it gives the Indigenous organization, and there's lots of ideas along that same vein, but I won't take up much time. But I was just toying with a thought that's challenging the youth of the Indigenous to put together best practices and run with it, and just keep hammering it and hammering it and hammering it, saying, look, 92 says you need to do something, not slow walk. What you need to do is use some of these best practices, and there are corporations that are currently contracting with the Indigenous organizations, and they can tell you what their best practices are. So it can be done, and there's no sense in waiting for 5 years and then trying to flip the switch and say, well, we need some time. We've been slow walking this thing for years now. So anyway, that's my rant.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment, because you just had me thinking of, the next webinar ideas around, what could be covered as kind of what ECDEV Corps and the youths need to look at as some of the opportunities or some of the challenges that are there in the existing procurement systems, and how to break that down. I've noticed where there could be opportunities to do that, like in IBA negotiations or negotiations where permitting is required by social license, there's more say. But if that isn't being brought forward on the table around not just set-asides, but open bids, where there's the criteria there to put more weight on the decision-making with procurement offices to consider 51% owned or controlled Indigenous business, with at least 33% of its workforce being Indigenous. So we see less of these paper JVs where we see an Indigenous ECDEV Corp JVing with a non-Indigenous ECDEV Corp, and it's really a contractual JV where the non-Indigenous business is managing that contract on behalf of the Indigenous business, but that Indigenous business does not get to a point to develop assets to take on some of the risk and develop capacity, because we see challenges in the vendor procurement system, bondability, insurance, the other aspects of being on a vendor's list, whether you're operating within a municipality area or a crown corporation. Trying to fight to get on that vendor's list requires that type of capacity, and for that strategy, that has to come from the ECDEV Corp right away. And I mentioned the other capacity piece is the entire financial management, bookkeeping, and reporting. We see a lot of LPs and a lot of Indigenous owned boards get struck, and then they start to run very quickly with huge growth and then get challenged at later years in year 2 and 3 to look at, well, how do we set up our systems in a proper way, and doing that also from an IT function to avoid some of the risks that come there with some of the data and data sovereignty and confidentiality and so forth. So this is a big topic for, perhaps another discussion, but really glad that you brought up the youth's role in Call to Action 92 and holding companies accountable for their spend. And then the other part is the pretend Indian issue that companies need to deal with around risk. We need to better qualify, companies need to better qualify that. We need to be more vocal on how that's enforced because of the those that are taking away opportunities from Indigenous business in the state that we're in today, because corporations don't have that system. Government doesn't have that system. Some are supporting, some businesses that could be of risk, and it was something that we need to deal with as a collective for sure.
Well, it sounds like you're going to be back with another webinar topic. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jason, for being here. Ken, again, thank you so much for your questions and your inquiries. We appreciate all of you for joining us this Wednesday. We hope to see you next time. We hope you have a good rest of the summer as well. So take care, and we will see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.